The name written in a margin can rearrange a life. I begin with that idea because the phrase in our title, the third decree, is not a passage from an ancient Spartan law code. It is an analytic label I use in this film, a heuristic to help us track how paperwork, names, and small objects could translate into real restrictions on captive women's bodies and kinship ties. There is no claim here that a text called the Third Decree sat in a stone archive. Instead, I propose it as a way of following an administrative choreography I see in registers and household books from other contexts, where I adapt those patterns to a Spartan setting. I will mark the move as reconstruction or as indefinido where details remain unknown. Imagine a folded scrap with a single stitched initial tucked beneath a bundle of ration tokens. Imagine a ledger line, brief and deliberate, that changes a woman's status from guest to something else on the space of an entry. Those small material traces are the hooks for our inquiry, how the act of writing, of reading a name aloud in front of officials, and of transferring objects can act as a technology of governance. That is the analytic spine I call the Third Decree, a four-moment sequence: discovery, naming, consecration or entry, and material consequence, through which rumor or allegation becomes a practical reconfiguration of daily life. If you want to see the documents we reference, the archival boxes and folios that inspired this approach are linked in the description, where passages of the film are reconstructed by analogy, drawn from patterns visible across household ledgers, stewards' logs, and conservation reports. Those segments are clearly marked. To begin, let me set out the method that structures this investigation. In several archival traditions, primarily in early modern and some medieval household record-keeping, administrative acts follow a predictable choreography. First, someone notices an irregularity or hears a complaint, discovery. That notice sets in motion a social and bureaucratic process. Second, the matter is made public or legible. A name is read aloud, entered into a register, or otherwise rendered formal, naming. Third, the entry itself functions like a consecration. Once fixed on the page and circulated among household officers, it acquires performative force, consecration or entry. Finally, the textual act is translated into material realities: new quarters, altered rations, changed access to kin and visitors. Material consequence. I want to be clear. This four-part sequence is an analytic tool drawn from comparative documentary patterns. It is not a direct transplant of practices attested in classical Spartan law codes. Classical Sparta's institutional vocabulary, the precise workings of its household structures, and which officials might have convened such a reading are indefinido in the documentary record I have before me, where I suggest names for roles or describe likely actors, household commanders, senior officers, or indefinido equivalents. I am hypothesizing, guided by how comparable bureaucracies operated in archives that have survived elsewhere. Every time I make such a hypothesis, I will label it as a reconstruction and explain the archival analogs informing it. What, then, might this third decree sequence look like when we imagine it operating in an environment of captive noblewomen living within the orbit of a dominant household or military household? The following is a compact reconstruction, explicitly inferential, built from patterns I have encountered in household ledgers, stewards' accounts, and material traces that survive when paper resists forgetting. It is a story of administration, not an indictment of unnamed individuals. It is meant to show mechanisms of control rather than to sensationalize harm. Reconstruction, based on comparative household ledgers and stewards' logs in analogous collections. A young captive identified in later registers as Lysandra is taken into a household affiliated with a Spartan command. The initial entries treating her presence are perfunctory: a brief ledger notation recording a bedroll issued, a small allowance of grain, perhaps a reference to an exchange of cloth. Those entries suggest temporary provisioning, not formal reallocation. At some point a rumor circulates, a whispered accusation, a complaint by another household member, a note from an external party. In the archive's later folios, we find an interleaving of shorthand notations, a marginal mark near Lysandra's name, an ink blot that has been scored over, and a later, clearer line that alters her status in the main ledger. That marginal mark is the discovery moment in the sequence, an irregularity registered by someone whose responsibility was to oversee provisioning or to keep order, an indefinido officer in a Spartan context. The record is ambiguous about who made the initial note. The hand is hurried, the ink thinner. In other archives, similar marginalia are the trace left when a steward hears a complaint and does nothing further, or when a messenger drops a slip into a chest of papers. Here, the marginal sign acts as the seed from which the following steps grow. The next stage is naming. In several entries that follow, a distinct hand writes Lysandra's name with a formulaic phrase beside it, a terse clause that, in comparable ledgers from other contexts, signals a status change. We cannot assume the exact phrasing used in Spartan administrative speech. Those words are indefinito. But the effect of the entry is consistent with a public naming, an administrative act intended to make the matter legible to the household's officers. In some manuscript traditions, this required a reading before the senior cohort, or an oral pronouncement. In others, it sufficed to produce a new line in the register. The key point is that the ledger line itself functions as a publicization. Once the name is inscribed in that particular formulaic way, a different set of rules attaches to it. Then comes the consecration or formal entry. The ledger's new line is copied, carefully, in a steadier hand, into the main register. Around that entry we find corroborating records, a token issued and stamped, a notation about a door key reallocation, an adjusted ration schedule. In archival parallels, clerks often duplicated the decisive line into the central folio that circulated among household officers, and in doing so, they transformed a rumor into an institutional fact. The act of copying is the act of fixing. Again, note that in a Spartan-specific sense, the identity and authority of those copying hands are indefinito. I am borrowing the logic of household clerical practice as an interpretive model. Finally, material consequence follows quickly. The ledger's new status for Lysandra is matched by immediate logistical shifts. The tokens that entitled her to communal bath rotation are now reissued with a different mark, suggesting restricted access. Her sleeping role is reassigned to a less central quarter, and the register lists a reduced grain allotment. A visitor's list shows fewer permitted names. These small bureaucratic changes reshape daily life. They alter where she sleeps, who may see her, how much food she receives, and what movements are allowed. In archival sources elsewhere, the aggregation of such small shifts creates the lived reality of exclusion or constraint. That is the central insight I want the third decree label to foreground. An administrative act composed of ink, tally marks, and tokens can reorganize intimacy and mobility. It is important to pause here and emphasize the limits of inference. None of the surviving entries I describe are labeled third decree in any ancient script. The name is mine. The identities of the officers who may have convened a reading, whether a household commander, an indefinito officer, or a group of peers, are not attested in the fragments at hand. Where the record is silent, I will say so. Where it yields patterns similar to other archives, marginal marks followed by duplications and material reassignments, I will note the analogy. Historical reconstruction is not a narrative of certainty. It is a disciplined argument built from traces. With the sequence established, we can examine the work the ledger actually does, materially and performatively. Paper and parchment are not neutral surfaces. Registers carry a grammar, columns for names, formulaic wording for status changes, rubrication, or a simple cross to mark particular cases that structures what action follows. An entry written in the right column does not merely record an event, it authorizes it. Consider tokens. These small pieces, metal counters, marked wooden discs, or inscribed bits of pottery, appear again and again in household contexts as instruments of entitlement. A token with a particular notch might entitle the bearer to a daily ration. Another type might grant access to a designated quarter. The ledger, in turn, records who is to receive which tokens and when. When the ledger's entry for Lysandra is altered, the token issued to her is changed accordingly. A clerk scratches a new mark on a token register. The steward distributes a differently notched piece, and the person at the gate or bath recognizes the token's authority. The token is small, portable, and material evidence of a textual decision. Doors and sleeping roles are another material vocabulary of enforcement. If the register reassigns an individual to a peripheral quarter, that reassignment requires a physical reconfiguration. Key holders must be instructed, bedding must be moved, and meal-serving routines must be altered. These are laborious processes. Work orders are generated, servants execute moves, and the household's rhythm changes. In the documents I examine, we see precisely those follow-through entries. A short note, bedroll moved, key surrendered, visitor denied. Each terse line points to work performed beyond the page. Registers do not float above social life, they mobilize it. The control extends to the body and administrative language around care. In the entries related to Lysandra's new status, there are notations that concern washing schedules, hair tending allocations, and the issuing of particular clothing pieces. These are not erotic descriptions, they are bureaucratic allocations of labor and resources. A record that alters who washes a captive's garments or who supervises her bathing is a record that reallocates intimate labor. Bathing in communal facilities, in some household contexts, was organized by rota and monitored by attendants. Changing a person's position in that rota changes both their privacy and who controls their daily exposure. Again, we must treat interpretation with caution. Where I read an entry indicating a changed washing rota, I am drawing on analogs from other archives where such phrasing corresponds with shifting household supervision. In a Spartan-specific sense, the precise social meanings attached to such entries are indefinido. But the broad point holds. Administrative notes about hygiene and clothing are not benign. They are mechanisms of bodily regulation enacted through mundane paperwork. If the ledger is the visible surface of governance, the archive's margins are where resistance, erasure, and memory coexist. The material record is rarely pristine. Across the folios we find evidence of editing, ink that has been scraped and smoothed, names partially removed and overwritten, folios trimmed, and then sewn back with a different thread. Those traces of alteration complicate any linear reading of authority. One of the most evocative survival types is the stitched initial. Someone, often a person with a private stake in what the ledger recorded, has taken the effort to sew an initial into a cuff, a hem, or a scrap hidden within a bundle. That stitch does something profound. It ties a person's memory to a physical object and hides that mark inside a textile fold where the household accountant's pen cannot easily reach. In several archival collections, stitched initials have been found where a ledger entry was otherwise unfavorable to the individual concerned. The stitched initial can be read as a counter-archive, a private act of witnessing and commemoration that resists institutional erasure. Hidden petitions are another form of counter-archive. A folded note, tucked between the boards of a household chest or sewn into the lining of a garment, can survive when formal paperwork is doctored or lost. These fragments do not carry the weight of official authority, but they provide a crucial alternative perspective, the voice of someone who sought redress outside the formal channels, or who left a personal account contradicting a ledger's terse line. When conservators have revealed such packets, often under raking light or with careful opening protocols, they have offered historians a more textured sense of what the ledger erased. All of this raises profound conservation and ethical questions. How do we recover fragile traces without destroying them? How do we balance the need for scholarly access with the responsibility to preserve items for descendants and communities? Here, practice matters as much as interpretation. Conservation techniques used today, raking light, multispectral imaging, and non-invasive surface analysis, are methods of recovery that allow us to read palimpsests and erased entries without abrading the object. Raking light, which casts low-angle illumination across a page, reveals impressions and scraped areas by accentuating the surface relief. Multispectral imaging uses different wavelengths of light to elicit residues of ink invisible to the naked eye, rendering overwritten or faded text legible in composite images. Both methods are forms of mediated seeing. They reveal what the naked eye cannot, but they depend on careful handling and professional judgment. A key ethical rule is this: prefer imaging and documentation to invasive extraction. If a petition is sewn into a hem, we should not advise descendants or researchers to rip the seam open in an amateur attempt at discovery. Conservation professionals have protocols for such interventions: consultation with stakeholders and mediated extraction in controlled environments, conservation-grade tools, and digitization plans that preserve the original while making its content accessible. In projects I've observed, conservators routinely involve descendant communities in decisions about whether and how to open containers or remove fragments. That involvement is not merely courteous, it is part of respecting the human lives embedded in the objects. Amelia, a conservator I worked with during related archival projects, put this plainly. The object's integrity and community consultation must guide intervention. When a stitched-in scrap is revealed, she said, we are dealing with someone's deliberate act of hiding. That act deserves the same respect we give to recorded law, even if the law is inconvenient. Dr. Lewis, an archivist who has overseen collections with sensitive provenance, added that the first question must always be to identify stakeholders, descendants, communities, or institutions with legitimate claims to custody. Professor Andrews, a social historian, reminded me that the archive is not an inert storehouse, but a contested field. What survives, and how we make it visible, shapes memory, she said, and shapes obligation. Those obligations extend to the genealogical consequences of ledger entries. A cramped line in a ledger could, across generations, produce misattributed descent, denial of inheritance, or civic exclusion. In some archival contexts, we find people appearing in later civic lists under an altered name or status, and the change can ripple outward into legal recognition and family claims. For descendants attempting to reconstruct family histories, the archive's silences and erasures present real-world harms. That is one reason why digitization, accompanied by professional metadata and contextual notes, matters. It allows research without the risk of repeated handling and places interpretive frames alongside images, so future readers understand the limits of what the documents can tell them. But digitization itself is not a cure-all. Scans divorced from context can be misread. Images shared without conservation notes can encourage amateur tampering. The ethical approach I advocate is layered. Digitize responsibly, annotate clearly, involve descendants early, and avoid unilateral extraction. Archives should develop mediated access pathways that allow scholars and descendants to collaborate on reading and interpretation without sacrificing the object's physical integrity. Returning now to the house-level mechanics, how do we trace the ledger's transition into daily enforcement? The key lies in the repeated choreography visible in the records. A notated change in rations is paired with an order to kitchen staff. A notation about quarters is linked to a key transfer. A note about restricted visitors appears alongside a steward's admonition. These administrative ripples are mundane but decisive. In one example from comparative archives, an entry that reclassified a woman's household status is immediately followed by a slender accounting line. Linen allotted, half ration from 10th. The next day, the kitchen ledger shows a corresponding reduction in grain disbursement. The bathing rota shows a reassignment. That pattern suggests a well-rehearsed mechanism. Clerks, stewards, and servants translate the ledger's lines into labor and logistics. In the Spartan analog reconstruction, we should expect similar practical follow-through, though again, the identities of the exact officers and terms are indefinito. It is instructive to consider how the ledger's performativity rests on social recognition. A token is effective only if gatekeepers recognize it. A sleeping role reassignment matters only if those managing quarters enforce it. That enforcement depends on chains of authority and daily routines. Thus, paperwork is at once symbolic and infrastructural. It is an inscription and a command, dependent on human actors who implement its details. We must also confront the uncomfortable question of intent and motive. The ledger's sparse hand gives us little access to inner lives. Motive may be political, personal, economic, or a combination. A reduced ration might be punitive, cost-saving, or a reflection of supply constraints. A naming entry might align with a household's effort to manage social risk, or to discipline members perceived as disruptive. As historians, we cannot reconstruct interiority from ledger lines alone. We can only offer plausible readings grounded in comparative evidence and cautious qualifiers. What the material record allows more securely is a mapping of consequence. Registers and tokens produce effects on mobility, diet, and access that can be documented and, in some cases, measured. Those effects should be our primary focus when assessing harm and institutional responsibility. The ledger is an instrument, and instruments produce measurable outcomes. Before closing, it is worth pausing on the archive as an ethical space. The documents we study carry lives, not abstractions. When a stitched initial is revealed or a hidden petition surfaces under raking light, we encounter an act of human reckoning. That act may be a plea for help, an affirmation of identity, or a private record of resistance. We have responsibilities in how we read and publicize those traces. Professional conventions, consulting conservators, involving descendants, annotating reconstructions, and avoiding sensational publication are not bureaucratic niceties. They are moral practices that respect the dignity of people who left those marks. The consequences of neglect are real. When records are digitized without commentary, later users may misinterpret entries as legal certainties. When conservation is performed without descendant consultation, communities may rightly object. When scholars present reconstructions without clear qualification, the public may assume fiction has become fact. The corrective is not to avoid interpretation, but to practice it responsibly. Mark conjecture, cite analogs, and keep the human stakes visible. Let me end where I began, with an emblem. A stitched cuff, hidden under a folded bundle, bearing an initial in thread that survived where a ledger aspired to forget. That small piece of cloth holds a tension between institutional power and private memory. The ledger would prefer tidy lines. The stitch resists tidy lines. In that tension, we see the archive's central drama, erasure and persistence locked together. If you are moved by this work, there are practical ways to help. Support digitization projects at local archives and historical repositories, but insist on professionally curated and annotated digitization, not raw scans without context. If you believe you may have fragile family papers or objects from a sensitive provenance, do not attempt forceful extraction or amateur cleaning. Contact a trained conservator and the holding archive. Request mediated consultation that respects both preservation and descendant interests. The description beneath this video includes links to archival resources, recommended conservation services, and the specific collections referenced in this film's comparative analysis. Where segments of this presentation are reconstructed by analogy, those segments are clearly labeled in the notes. The third decree is not a law I found carved in stone. It is an analytic lens for seeing how paperwork can act like law. It invites us to attend to the mundane instruments of governance, ledgers, tokens, keys, and stitches, and to recognize that what looks like a dry column of ink can rearrange a life. Our duty, as scholars, caretakers, and viewers, is to treat those traces with the rigor of method and the responsibility of ethics. Preserve the documents. Involve the descendants. Read cautiously. And remember the small stitch. Wherever institutions try to forget, human memory finds ways to persist.